in heraldry, white and silver are interchangeable, something that most people don't realize. Well, here is the case that was made at the symposium, and it's been made year after year after year. Well, if Carl Ludwigson says it, and he has it in his books, particularly Quicksilver Century, if Carl says it, and Carl's a good friend of mine, it must be true. Manfred von Brauswitz, who was a driver in the 1934 race that all this happened, says it was true. And Rudolf Uhlenhaut, who one of the best engineers in the automotive industry from the 1930s into the 60s, who could drive a racing car just as fast as most of the drivers on the team, he said, yeah, it's true. So you've got those guys, very high, pretty weighty evidence, people saying, yeah, this is just as true. We have problems with we have the white wheel problem we'll talk about. I've already mentioned that they bring up the fact that it's not very reliable, the evidence from the photographs. They said white wheels. Also, you have Hermann Lang, who was one of the mechanics at this time before he became a driver. And in Christopher Hilton's book, Racing the Silver Arrows, which we have at the center, and if you don't have it in your library, you should. It's a great book. This is not one of his better pieces, but it's a very good book, one of the better ones on this period. Long says, yeah, they were white, became silver. And then on a nostalgia forum, a forum on the internet, someone named Tony Kay built this whole case about basically, why would these people lie? What's the issue? If they were white, they became silver? Who cares? Well, sometimes facts do get in the way of things. We'll talk about that. And then Harvey Rowe, as I pointed out, spoke at the symposium and told us a lot about Neubauer. Neubauer was a great storyteller, and the problem he had was that he would turn the tape recorder on, and Neubauer would grab the microphone and just start talking and talking, would not let Harvey get any questions in. So he has a very attractive wife. So what would happen is he got his wife to talk to Neubauer and ask the question. And since Neubauer always had an eye for pretty women, he actually would slow down enough so that questions would be asked and they get it recorded. So, on the other hand, the people like Doug Nye and I, we kept saying, well, we don't find anything in the contemporary accounts. I mean, even if it's even a humorous story about here are these great engineers at Mercedes who design a car to a certain weight limit, they show up for a race, and oh, heavens to Betsy, it doesn't quite meet the standard it's supposed to meet. And they come up with a very ingenious way to solve it. It doesn't appear anywhere in the contemporary accounts. We've looked. The books that were written in the 30s, in the 40s, and into the 50s, we don't find it. There's nothing. Not until Alfred Neubauer actually brings this up in his book, which doesn't appear until like 1958, 1960. We'll come to that. Also, once we began looking in and had access to the Mercedes-Benz archives, and most of the photos you've seen already are from Mercedes, we had some access to their archival material. Also, we have another eyewitness account. They had theirs, we had ours. Eugen Riekle stated that, hey, I was a mechanic, I was there, I worked on the cars, and when they showed up at the Nürburgring, hey, they were already silver. And 1994, probably the first time some articulated taking on Mercedes and Daimler, well, maybe the story's not true. And for some of us, that was pretty much the catalyst for us saying, wait a minute, let's start asking some questions about this. We accept a lot of things on faith. As a good Lutheran, I know how that works. But when you're a historian, you kind of have to be a little leery of that. So we began asking some questions. When the conference was over, we came up with two, what I call kind of Weasley conclusions. Uh, yeah, to get the word alleged in there was very difficult. And again, it's really not until 1938 that the term silver pitiful or silver arrows really comes into wide use in the publicity for the Mercedes and the auto union cars. Not until 38. This is the one we fought hard to get in. So we said it's a great story, sounds wonderful, but we have some doubts about it, and we would really like to dig further into it. Needs further work. And Marty says, you know, thank you for coming, thank you for playing. It did not go well for Mercedes. A dear friend of mine who put this whole thing on, Dr. Ernst, he was sent off to the city car part of Mercedes to be their director of communications. And if you know anything about Mercedes, city car is kind of like the outer ring of hell. It's kind of like Mongolia if you're working at the corporate level. So he was sent off to work there. So who was Neubauer? Who's the guy who's really at the center of all this? Here's the good Alfred Don Alfredo, as he was called. Born in what is now part of the Czech Republic, that time in Austria-Hungary. Passed away in Stuttgart in 1980. He was the manager of the racing team from 1926 until his retirement from that role in 1955. Over here is Neubauer at the wheel of one of the Mercedes that competed in the, this is an Austro-Daimler, that competed in the Targa Florio race in Sicily. And you probably heard of this guy's cars. That's Ferdinand Porsche, right there. This is, there's Neubauer. This is taken during the record run to 1938. And this is a picture taken with Neubauer and some drivers in Monza in 1954. There's Neubauer. Here's Hermann Lang. This is some Martini driver named Fangio. Here is Karl Kling. And here is Hans Hermann, who we saw earlier, one of the drivers that time. This is Hermann Lang in we think this is about 1936 or 37. Hermann Lang, and of course Rudi Carasciolo, the great German champion driver. And this is in 1954 at the French Grand Prix when the Mercedes made its return after the war. And this is probably when I think of Neubauer, this is probably the picture that comes to mind. It just shows him at work. Ran the team with an iron fist. And this is the book that's at the root of all this. This is the original cover. This is the reprint that just came out several years ago. Männer, Frauen und Motoren. It was translated and published into English in 1960. It came out in 1958. And this is when everything starts happening. After the book comes out in English in 1960, starting about 2 years later, we get all these stories about the paint stripping coming into magazines. So there seems to be some correlation between the appearance of the Neubauer book and all these stories in English appearing about something that had never really been discussed prior to that. So let's look at the one, whoops, let me go back. As it pointed out, the design began in March 1933, was rolled out, appeared, there was testing in February, March. The first time it was actually on the track was in February, March time frame, given to the press. There was more testing. showed up at the Elvis for an Elvis race, and then this is the race we're really concerned about, and this is when it made its appearance on the Grand Prix stage in July 1934 in France. Showed you this earlier. This is the fourth of the 125s. It's 105-194. The fact we actually know all the chassis numbers of these cars, I think, is pretty interesting. It was restored without the headrest that it originally had. Here is the sixth one built, the last one built in 1934, with their headrest. This is when it was being displayed without being restored, fully restored. And if you go to the Mercedes Museum today, that's what it looks like. So, these are the cars that were built. Now, this is when it was rolled out in December 1933, a bitterly cold day. If you look, you can see it's snow on the ground. People are dressed very warmly. If you look at the car closely, it's kind of confusing. It's a very, very light color. Initially, we were told that that was white, but when you began looking closely at the same car, start comparing with the white shirts and the bodywork of the car, you begin seeing, well, it seems to be kind of a dull color. Doesn't seem to be kind of a brilliant white at all. You would think if you're going to paint it, it'd be something more. Again, kind of difficult. Primarily, Doug and I came to the conclusion is a problem. This is basically due to the processing in this particular view. When aluminum is that cold, we're talking the day was probably somewhere around 6-8 below on Celsius. So we're talking down the teens in Fahrenheit. So when if you ever seen raw aluminum at those temperatures, it's a very dull, brightish color, and it hasn't been lacquered or anything. So, but then you look. So we think that it's really iffy that it was ever white to begin with. Well, a couple of weeks later, it's shown at the Berlin Auto Show, and there's some well-known German politician here in the pictures. If you notice, look at the collar, and you look at the car, you'll notice it doesn't seem to be very white. There seems to be a dullness, some type of dull gray, silver. It doesn't seem to be very white. And remember, this is one of the original cars. So if they're going to be white, they were going to be probably painted at the very beginning. Again, another that well-known German politician. This came from the book itself that Neubauer wrote, and this is another one from the archives of at Mercedes. And you can see very clearly it's not white. There's great reason to doubt that it was ever white. In Monza, there was testing in March. There was some testing earlier, but it was not until, and you can see the white background contrasts very much with the bodywork. Again, this is in March, and even in this highly, highly retouched photograph, you can see there's some contrast. The white doesn't quite match the rest of it. Later in March, it was presented to the press. This is a highly retouched photograph. This is retouched, that's added. This is an original photograph, and here's one of the same car that has been retouched. Notice the white from the Deutschland and for the license, definite contrast. And we're talking in March, very much so. Again, another picture of the another photograph of the card, which gives it even greater definition. Very much that this is not white. At least nothing white that I'm aware of. Again, another set of pictures. It definitely shows up the contrast here and here. This is one of the best pictures, I think, that really dramatically shows not only just the car, but the contrast between the license and the bodywork. So far, I haven't seen anything conclusively to tell me that the cars were white. Now let's talk about the auto unions. They appeared at basically the same time. People have tried to say that this is white, but when we went back and took a better look at some of the photographs, it's another dull color. Certainly not a white. But we never found any photographs of any auto union ever being white. So obviously something's going on here. And by the way, I talked about earlier, the very start, about the collective effort. Holger Merton and Michael Mueller really needed to be at the symposium, unfortunately could not be there, who provided us a lot of the work of their research so that Doug and I benefited from their hard work. I mean, this is always a collective effort. Well, in April 1934, we have Auschwitz, and we have one of the other, the cars there for testing. And white uniform, it doesn't seem to be really white. Now, notice the wheels. The wheels are white. No denying that. They are white. But once you get von Auschwitz into the cockpit, that car, you notice the registration number and the bodywork. Oh, by the way, this is a rare photograph of von Auschwitz smiling, by the way. Does not seem to be any white to be seen. Again, show the contrast. But Auschwitz managed to correct it during the testing. And here are the mechanics looking at it. Not very happy group, but it certainly does seem to be something that looked like silver. So the first race that they were going to actually participate in was at the track in Berlin, the Avis, in late May. This is Rudi Carrschola. That's Neubauer. This is one of the cars. This is a different car. We've seen the pictures of the first two cars. This is the third car that was built. You would figure if they're going to paint them white, by now they would have painted them white. White linen helmet. The bodywork definitely looks and appears to be something besides white. And this is the same photograph taken from the Bundesarchiv, the Federal Archives in Germany. This is Carrschola, white cloth helmet, linen helmet, and we've been told that this was white. It doesn't look very white, and it's the same car he was just sitting in. We know that. So somehow, out on the track, either they painted it white or it was silver. And here is the cars that were at, two of the cars, and it's very clear that if they're white, it doesn't look very white. It's certainly not a very brilliant white. They all seem to be some type of a gray or dull color. So they didn't start at the Avisrennen because the cars all failed to start because they had fuel feed problems, fuel pumps, and some issues. So they didn't start. However, the event that they were entered in was not a 750 kilogram weight class. It was simply cars over a certain displacement. So they could have, like I said, they could have weighed 900 kilograms. Nobody would have bothered. But they had been weighed, and they met the weight here in late May. Something that gets left out a lot of times. Here's the Nürburgring. all 22.810 kilometers of it. They were going to compete in a class for, the Kraftwagen over 1500 cc's. And all the big people are there. It's quite an event. This is going to be it wasn't supposed to be their first race, but it's going to be. So they're putting everything's going to be going big time. Again, here we have a picture. We've been told the car is white. This is a car that just a week earlier in Berlin certainly looked silver. So either during the couple of days between hand, it was painted white, or it was silver. We've had one of the German LJs at Yachts, but again, the problems with black and white photographs is they're not developed in certain ways. Different film come out. A number of us have looked at this. I know Doug and I talked about this. And to me, I don't buy that it was white. I really can't accept that. Here's the weight bridge at the Nürburgring. You can see these are the auto unions coming through, and so part of the story is, however, how they're being weighed with all their wheels and the tires still on, probably show they're just rolling through to take all that off. Plus, they have to be drained of all the fluids. But then again, it wouldn't have mattered what they weighed because of the class they're racing in. Here are the infamous W25s. Here's the weight bridge. And apparently, they still have the tires on the wheels. So the likelihood this is an official weighing is something to be, up in the air. Again, here are the cars in the paddock area and being scrutinized. And if you look closely, there just seems to be some reason to believe that they're not white. Contrast this medic's badge with the car in front of you. This is during the scrutinizing period when there supposedly had been white. There doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence to support that they were white. Here are the cars, and notice they're not, it's just been numbered, coming out, and they're definitely silver by now. This is the picture taken by the mechanic had, Eugen Rischler, that shows the cars with the mechanics, and those are not white cars. If they were going to be white, this is one of the times they would have been white. As Rischler said, they were gray, silver when they showed up at the race. And again, we'll run through pretty quickly. This is the grid. They have been officially now gray, silver. This is a Bugatti. It is white. I don't think you have a lot of problems telling it's a white Bugatti. That's the sort of white that these cars would have been painted if they were being painted in white earlier. I mean, this is pretty much a standard type of white appearance that you would expect from cars being entered by German in a race. Again, most of the cars we've seen up to now, they've all looked something like that, not this. You have Fajoli and you have von Brauschwitz. They run off with the race, basically. And then here's von Brauschwitz coming across the finish line, victory. So what do you think? Did Neubauer have a dilemma? Were his cars overweight and he had to strip the paint off? Turned, white cars into silver? As much as I admire Carl and a bunch of other folks, I think the weight of the evidence is against the fact that this little minor, no big deal story really does not seem to have much in the way of roots of reality. It's a wonderful story. It's great. I had no reason to disbelieve it for years until I started peeling it back. So my closing thoughts are basically that one of the bad things we do as historians is when we ask questions, we often don't know where we're going to go with them. What you saw here is basically, I would call that the Reader's Digest condensed version. There's a lot more, like I said, we spent an entire day of a lot of professional historians, and history is a contact sport, by the way. Going back and forth for a day, arguing over this. And this has been a discussion that's literally gone over for years. But as a professionally trained historian, I have to look at what I come up with. In this case, having asked questions, did this really happen? Did Neubauer have a dilemma? Did that dilemma, when did it happen, if he had one? It doesn't seem to have happened there. When I do my analysis, I keep moving towards the fact the cars were probably never white. So my interpretation is that good story, wonderful tale, but there doesn't seem much basis in it. So why does Mercedes buy into this? And when did Mercedes buy into this? And whatever possessed Neubauer to have this story in the first place? And that we don't have a conclusive answer on. Neubauer was never, from my understanding, asked that directly and gave a direct answer to it. But there was an incident back at the turn of the 20th century in international racing where the cars could weigh 1,000 kilograms, or 1,007 if they had a magneto. That several cars, and I think it was the Gordon Bennett, according to which story you hear, probably the Gordon Bennett race, where they were over 1,000 kilograms. So they had to be lightened. So some modifications made to the car to get them back down under the weight limit. We think that is probably the genesis for the Neubauer story. It's not a well-known fact, but Neubauer was really well-versed in automotive racing history. Sometimes he got it wrong. I'm not even going to talk about the 1933 Grand Prix Tripoli, the race that was rigged. It really wasn't. That's another story that came out of this. But in this particular case, it's very clear that whatever his motivations were, it was the fact that he was not going to let a good story be spoiled by the facts. And so my interpretation is the fact that, that word again, that if you accept his story, it's an alternative fact. And this is something we're always concerned about. Kill the historians. That seems to be a real loud cry at times, because we really spoil a good story sometimes. And basically, pending your questions, that's pretty much it. I think try to give it to where we did not go into, get my show and tell here. This is what Mercedes generated for the symposium. This is the copy I brought back for the research center from Stuttgart. I have a copy, my personal copy, and I got one for the. It's heavy reading. There's a lot of wonderful, great research that Mercedes put together. There's a lot more where this came from that some of the rest of them have added to it. But it's worth your while to go take a look at it when you get an opportunity here. It might, if you're good at, how many of you understand the fact that in German there's like real real writing, and there's a thing called fractor, that little convoluted little writing that they. Reading some of the articles in here from the 1930s is brutal. I read German quite well, but your eyes give out after about an hour or two trying to decipher some of this stuff. But this is, again, we use Mercedes and their, their material against them. They took it well, but they just ignored us. So basically, subject to any questions or comments, that's what I've got.
I have a two-part question. One is I've read a number of times that Alfred Neubauer was famous for elaborating the truth. I can't recall exactly what they were, but there were a couple of stories. And number one, did you say that this entire symposium was about the paint, or did they cover other topics?
The story that, Neubauer is revered at Daimler in Stuttgart. This whole story, and it was a story that was actually published, it's taken very seriously. Again, until 1960, we really don't, 58, 60 time frame, we don't hear about this story. If he told it privately, it may have been out there. But the fact that he told the story and convinced people, let's face it, people read the book and were convinced this was the truth. So the fact that we actually had a symposium just about one little story, I'm quite serious. I about fell over when Joseph Ernst called me. Now, I had just come back from the Middle East. I had been over there for like 2 years at that time and had just kind of picked this up again. And he called me up and said, how'd you like to come to Stuttgart? And I said, jawohl. I'm yours. Yeah. And talk about this. So, yes, they take it very seriously. Like I said, you saw that they have it in the museum, despite the fact that we have told them time and time again. But it's like, who are you going to believe? Don Alfredo? Or are you going to believe these old silly scholars type of deal? So we take rejection well.
I have a question. Do you have any idea what the weight saved by the paint might have been?
I'm sorry, I couldn't, the weight?
The weight of the paint that they would have stripped, how much that would have been?
The total, like I said, the racing weight under the international formula from 34 to 37, 750 kilograms. But when you got the entire car, tires, fuel, and everything, it was about 815, 20 kilograms, maybe more than that, closer to 900. But yeah, most of the cars on the scales weighed, I think in Monterrey for the French Grand Prix, most of their weights were like 730, 725. They were well under the weight limit. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that answered what you were.
So the question, Don, was how much did the paint add to the weight?
Oh, I'm sorry. The lacquer, the paint. Good question. We don't know because it was never taken off. Now, if you actually look at one of these are not, if you look at the Porsche Carrera and you look at that wonderful paint job and the bodywork, when you look at one of these cars, I should go back to one of these pictures. They are not pristine. I saw this. Get back. But the paint could have not, it was probably several kilos. But when you're 1 kilo over, I don't think anybody is really going to have, I mean, 1 kilo, that's really not that hard to get rid of. You could pull a couple of spark plugs out. This gives you an idea. This is actually in better shape. The bodywork, most of this has been restored, but if you were to look very closely, before they did some of the restoration work, there's filler, there's the thickness varies from place to place. So if you put a lacquer, a coating of paint on it, and that's a fairly small vehicle, to get rid of 1 kilo, there was a lot of different ways to do it, and that's the other fallacy. I mean, engineers. I have a son who's an engineer. That would be the last thing that he would look at. Like I said, you could take some spark plugs out of the engine. You could do all sorts of things. You could get that last. When you start looking at it from a logical viewpoint, and then and again, the reason I brought up the weights, when you find out that these cars had been weighed in Berlin, had been met the weight standard easily, and then when they show up in France for the race, they're like 15, 20 kilos under. This is after they've been modified to weigh more. You begin to have some serious logical, again, let's don't let facts get in the way of a good story. But yeah, I mean, honest to God, we've actually had discussions lasting days over the whole thing about, well, how much did the paint weigh? So.
Okay. In any good murder mystery story, we are taught the aphorism in Latin, cui bono, who benefits. Did anybody make money out of this fantasy or this story? Did he sell more books? What was the purpose of propagating this, as you would call it, a myth?
That is the $64,000 question. I mean, yeah, but really, that is something we just have had discussions about. Why in the world? What was the motivation? What would have caused this story to be generated? What was the benefit? Because when you ask, well, who benefits? Really, nobody. It's just a wonderful story. And if you think about it in one way, it doesn't really reflect well on the Mercedes engineers not having a car show up ready to go that meets the weight standard. This would have been, now remember, we're talking a regime, a government regime that takes things extremely seriously. You saw the well-known German politician there. He was serious as a coronary thrombosis when it came to things in sport and engineering. I mean, this was a prestige item, so you're correct. Who would benefit from a story like this? If it was supposed to be kind of a ha-ha sort of thing, okay, I didn't get the joke, if you will. But on the other hand, look how within the automotive racing history, it has been accepted. I don't think anybody really challenged it for years. I never gave it much thought. I said, well, I was kind of stupid, but these things, like I said, I was in the Army for 33 years. I understand things get stupid at times. So, yeah, I never could figure it out. And again, we asked the people at Mercedes, well, what exactly was the benefit from this story? And basically it comes back to what you just basically inferred. It's a good story.
Any other questions? Don, thank you very much. You'll be able to speak to Don one-on-one, and I invite you to join us for a reception over at the Research Center. Thanks for coming.